My name is Jerome. I am 68 years old. I am a retired heavy diesel mechanic. I spent 40 long years up to my elbows in thick grease and engine grime, keeping massive commercial freight trucks running all across the highways of the Midwest. I traded the cartilage in my joints for a steady paycheck. My knees pop like firecrackers every time the weather changes, and my lower back is completely shot from lifting heavy transmission parts. But I never complained once. I destroyed my body gladly, so my family could sleep comfortably in a beautiful, sprawling suburban home right outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Every busted knuckle and every oil-stained shirt was for them. I have a son named DeAndre. He is 32 years old now and the pride of my life. He was never the loud or boastful type. He is deeply quiet, highly observant, and possesses a brilliant mind. He works as a forensic accountant, tracking complex numbers and financial webs that most people cannot even begin to comprehend. DeAndre gave me the absolute light of my life, my beautiful 8-year-old granddaughter, Aaliyah. That little girl is the very air in my lungs. She is the reason I kept waking up before dawn every single day. But let me tell you a harsh truth I had to learn the hardest way possible. The ultimate evil in this world does not break into your house wearing a ski mask in the dead of night. Sometimes the devil is the person who has been sleeping on the exact same mattress as you for 35 years. I'm talking about my wife, Valerie. When my sweet little Aaliyah was fighting for her very life in a cold hospital bed, the doctors told us the only experimental surgery that could save her would cost $20 million. My wife, Valerie, looked at that astronomical price tag, looked at our dying granddaughter, then calmly grabbed her designer purse and walked right out the hospital doors like our blood was not even worth saving. She left us for dead, but she severely underestimated the quiet man she called her son. What DeAndre did in our darkest hour was an unthinkable choice that shocked everyone and brought a corrupt empire completely to its knees. Before I get into the heavy details of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that a father's love can conquer any evil and that karma always collects its debts. Tell me your city and the time you are listening to this, because I really want to know where all my strong, beautiful queens are tuning in from today. To understand how Valerie could do something so wicked, you have to understand the foundation of our household. For decades, I was the muscle and she was the financial manager. I handed over every single paycheck I ever earned without a second thought. I would come home smelling like diesel exhaust and industrial soap, too exhausted to even eat dinner half the time. I trusted her implicitly. I believed marriage was an equal partnership where one person built the house and the other turned it into a loving home. I thought we were building a solid legacy for DeAndre and his future children. But while I was under the hood of an 18-wheeler freezing in the brutal winter and roasting in the humid southern summer, Valerie was building a completely different kind of life. She grew increasingly obsessed with high society. Her desires started changing rapidly. A nice, comfortable house in Atlanta was not enough anymore. She wanted the elite country club memberships, the luxury imported cars, and the designer clothes that cost more than the first truck I ever bought. Her toxic obsession was constantly fueled by her sister Vivian. Vivian married a wealthy white American man named Richard Montgomery. Richard is the kind of man who wears custom-tailored suits that cost $10,000 and looks down his arrogant nose at anyone who actually works with their hands for a living. He runs a massive healthcare insurance conglomerate. He practically prints his own money and walks around like he owns the earth. Whenever we had family dinners, Richard and Vivian would sit across from me at my own dining table, eating the expensive food I paid for, and they would subtly mock my blue-collar roots. They would make little passive-aggressive comments about my rough, calloused hands or my simple vocabulary. They called my lifelong career a dirty job. Valerie never once defended me. In fact, she would join right in. She would laugh at their cruel jokes and look at me with this quiet, undeniable disdain. She called me embarrassing behind closed doors. She said I lacked ambition because I was happy being a mechanic. I swallowed my heavy pride every single time. I kept my mouth shut and forced a polite smile because I believed in keeping the peace for the sake of the family. I thought family was family no matter how flawed or disrespectful they were. I was a total fool to think that way. I was willfully blinding myself to the monster growing right under my own roof. I thought my hard work was earning me their respect, but it was only buying them time to use me. They did not just disrespect me. They underestimated DeAndre too. Richard always thought DeAndre was weak simply because he was quiet. He thought a young black man staring at accounting spreadsheets was absolutely no threat to his multi-million-dollar empire. Richard loved to flaunt his immense wealth in front of my son, offering him entry-level jobs at his massive conglomerate just to demean his current profession. DeAndre would just politely decline, smile faintly, and keep his eyes entirely focused. They did not realize that my son is not weak at all. He just waits for the exact right moment to speak. Every time I looked at little Aaliyah, I knew I had to protect her from that toxic side of the family tree. She was pure and innocent. She loved her grandfather unconditionally. She would run to the front door when I got home from the humid garage, grab my big rough hands and tell me how strong I was. She did not care about designer purses or elite country clubs. She just cared about genuine love. I spent my entire adult life trying to be the unbreakable bedrock for my family. I sacrificed my own comfort, my own dreams, and my own physical health so that my wife and son would never know what it means to struggle. I thought my daily sacrifice was an impenetrable shield that would protect us from the harshness of the outside world. But I was building a fortress out of sand. The storm was coming rapidly, and it was not coming from the outside. It was brewing right inside my own living room. The day Aaliyah collapsed, everything I thought I knew was destroyed forever. Let me tell you a terrifying truth about this world. We are taught from a very young age to fear the unknown. We lock our front doors at night, we check the security cameras, and we avoid dark alleys because we genuinely believe the worst monsters are strangers hiding in the shadows. We think true wickedness wears a ski mask and breaks through a glass window to steal from us when we are not looking. But that is a lie. The most dangerous kind of evil does not have to break into your home by force. You invite it in willingly. You give it a key to your sanctuary. You marry it. You build a whole life around it, and you sleep right next to it in the exact same bed for 35 straight years. You share your meals with it and tell it your deepest fears, never once realizing that it is silently taking notes on exactly how to destroy you when you are most vulnerable. That was my wife, Valerie. For over 3 decades, I looked at her and saw the mother of my child, the partner of my youth, and the woman I swore to protect with my dying breath. I never saw the absolute void where her soul was supposed to be until the darkest day of my entire life. The hospital room was so incredibly cold. I will never forget that sterile chemical smell or the agonizing rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. It was the only sound keeping me tethered to reality while my beautiful 8-year-old granddaughter, Aaliyah, lay in that oversized bed looking so small and frail. The doctors had just delivered the kind of news that stops your heart completely in your chest. They told us her rare condition was deteriorating rapidly. They said the only thing on this earth that could save her was a highly experimental, customized gene therapy surgery located at a specialized research facility. It was a miracle cure, but it came with an impossible, crushing price tag. $20 million. That number hung as the heavy hospital air like a physical weight, suffocating all the hope right out of the room. $20 million for the life of an innocent child. It is a number so large, it does not even sound real to a working man like me. I turned to Valerie, my mind racing with 100 different desperate plans. I was ready to sell the house, empty my retirement accounts, sell my truck, and work until my hands bled. I was ready to give my own organs if I had to. I expected to see the exact same fierce desperation in her eyes. I expected the grandmother of my sweet Aaliyah to hold me tight and say, "We will find a way, Jerome. We will do whatever it takes to save our baby." But when I looked at her face, my blood ran completely cold. There were no tears falling down her cheeks. There was no panic in her breathing. There was only this chilling, empty calculation. She looked at the doctor, and then she looked at Aaliyah. It was not a look of love or grandmotherly warmth. It was the exact look of a cold corporate businesswoman evaluating a bad financial investment. She heard the staggering price of $20 million, and she made her final decision right then and there. Without shedding a single tear or saying a single word of comfort, Valerie reached down and grabbed her expensive designer purse. She adjusted the leather strap on her shoulder, smoothing out her silk blouse, and she looked at me with eyes so dead and hollow they sent a shiver straight down my spine. She did not even walk over to touch Aaliyah's small hand one last time. She just turned her back on us, and she walked right out of those sliding hospital doors. The clicking of her expensive heels echoing down the hallway sounded like a death sentence. She walked away from her own flesh and blood, because in her mind our lives were simply not worth the cost. She abandoned us in our most desperate hour, fully assuming we would just roll over and accept our tragic fate. She thought I was just a broken-down old mechanic who could not fight back against the wealthy elite. And maybe I was. But what she completely forgot to factor into her cruel, selfish equation was my son DeAndre. When Valerie walked out that door, leaving his only daughter behind to die, she expected him to shatter into a million pieces. She thought he would collapse under the unbearable weight of that $20 million medical bill and beg for her help. But DeAndre did not cry. He did not fall to his knees in despair. I watched my quiet, gentle son transform right before my very eyes. He stood by that hospital bed, and a cold, hard focus washed over his entire body. DeAndre is a brilliant man who deeply understands how the hidden world of wealth, greed, and secrets operates. He knew exactly what Valerie and her arrogant billionaire brother-in-law had been doing in the dark all these years. He knew the dirty money they were hiding. And in that silent hospital room, while his daughter was fighting for every single breath, DeAndre made a choice that absolutely no one saw coming. He did not yell or run down the hallway to chase after her. He just calmly opened his laptop. What my son did next was so unthinkable, so flawlessly executed, and so devastatingly powerful that it completely shook the foundations of high society. He did not use his fists or a weapon to get revenge. He used his brilliant mind to orchestrate a retaliation that shocked everyone and brought a corrupt empire instantly to its knees. He turned their own greed into a financial guillotine they could never escape. Keep listening closely, because I'm going to tell you exactly how a quiet accountant and an old grease monkey took down the untouchables and forced them to pay every single cent. To truly understand how a betrayal of this magnitude can completely shatter a man's soul, you have to understand the foundation of blood, sweat, and unseen tears that our entire marriage was built upon. When Valerie and I first got together, we did not have a dime to our names. We were just two young kids in Atlanta, trying to carve out a decent life. I made a silent vow back then that I would break my own back before I ever let my family go without. That is exactly what I did. I became a heavy diesel mechanic. It is not a glamorous profession. There are no corner offices or fancy catered lunches. My office was the freezing concrete floor of a sprawling industrial garage. My cologne was the permanent smell of motor oil, diesel exhaust, and harsh industrial degreaser. I would spend 12 to 14 hours a day wrestling with massive steel engine blocks and tearing down complex semi-truck transmissions. It was back-breaking, agonizing work. I would come home so physically exhausted that my hands would literally cramp into tight fists while I was trying to hold my fork at the dinner table. My joints ached with a deep, bone-chilling pain that no amount of hot water could ever wash away. But every single Friday when the foreman handed me that paper paycheck, I felt like the richest man in the entire world. I never once opened that envelope to look at the numbers. I walked straight through our front door, kissed my wife on the cheek, and handed that envelope directly to Valerie. That was our established dynamic for over 3 decades. I was the muscle, and she was the manager. I trusted her with my entire existence. I believed that a marriage was a sacred partnership where two people pulled the heavy cart of life together. I provided the raw physical labor, and she managed the household finances. I never asked to see a single bank statement. I never questioned a single purchase she made. I thought checking up on her would be an insult to the sacred vows we took in front of God and our families. I just put my head down and worked harder every single time she said things were getting tight. If she told me we needed a new roof, I picked up double Saturday shifts. If she said little DeAndre needed braces or new school clothes, I worked straight through Sunday without a single complaint. I sacrificed my knees, my lower back, and my precious youth because I deeply believed I was building an unbreakable fortress for my family to live in. But somewhere along that long, difficult road, the woman I married started to fundamentally change. It was not a sudden, violent explosion. It was a slow, creeping poison that seeped into the very foundation of our home. At first, it was just small things. The perfectly good furniture we had bought together was suddenly not good enough anymore and had to be replaced with expensive custom pieces. The modest family vacations we used to take were replaced by her demanding luxury trips to resorts that I could never attend because I was too busy working overtime just to pay for them. I thought she just wanted nice things. After all the sacrifices I made, I wanted her to have them. I wanted my wife to feel like an absolute queen. But it was never enough. The more overtime I worked, the more her ravenous appetite for luxury grew. And worse than the reckless spending was the agonizing way she started looking at me. I used to come home from the garage and she would greet me with a warm, loving smile. But as the years dragged on, that smile turned into a tight, flat line of disappointment. She would look at my grease-stained work boots and my calloused hands with total disgust. She started complaining endlessly about the smell of my work uniforms. She would demand that I shower in the freezing basement bathroom so I would not track my dirty working-class life into her pristine, expensive master suite. I was paying for the very floor she stood on, but she was starting to treat me like hired help in my own home. I was too blinded by my fierce devotion to see the agonizing truth. She was not just falling out of love with me. She was becoming totally obsessed with a superficial world I could never belong to. That toxic obsession was poured like pure gasoline onto a fire when her older sister Vivian got married. Vivian married a white American man named Richard Montgomery. Richard was everything I was not. He was born into old generational wealth and he multiplied it by running a massive corporate healthcare insurance conglomerate. He was a wealthy, arrogant man who wore $10,000 custom-tailored suits and drove imported sports cars that cost more than my entire retirement fund. Richard made his millions by sitting in air-conditioned boardrooms, finding legal loopholes to deny sick people their life-saving insurance claims so his massive company could post record profits. He was a ruthless corporate shark who walked around treating every single person he met like they were dirty dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. And for some sick, twisted reason, Valerie absolutely idolized him. She looked at Richard and Vivian, and she saw the life she truly believed she deserved. She saw the elite country clubs, the extravagant charity galas, and the high society status that a blue-collar mechanic from Atlanta could never provide. Whenever Vivian and Richard came over for family dinners, it was absolute psychological torture for me. Richard would sit at the head of my dining room table, drinking the expensive wine I worked 60 hours a week to buy, and he would speak to me like I was a remarkably slow child. He would make cruel, passive-aggressive comments about how the trades were noble work. But it was a real shame I never had the intellect to build real substantial wealth. He would loudly discuss his massive stock portfolios and his hidden offshore accounts, deliberately using complex financial jargon just to make me feel small and uneducated in my own home. The most heartbreaking, agonizing part of it all was that Valerie never once defended me. Instead of standing up for the loyal man who broke his body every day to give her a beautiful, comfortable life, Valerie joined right in with them. She would laugh at Richard's cruel jokes. She would nod enthusiastically when Vivian bragged about their latest luxury trip to Europe while pointedly mentioning that Jerome probably could not get the time off from his dirty little garage to ever see Paris. I sat there chewing my food, swallowing my immense pride, and ignoring the burning righteous indignation rising in my chest. I did it because I was a peaceful man who put family above my own ego. I thought I was being the bigger man. I thought my quiet dignity and my hard work would eventually earn their respect. I did not realize I was just giving them permission to completely destroy me. Valerie's obsession with the Montgomery lifestyle became a terminal sickness. She started spending all her free time with Vivian, trying desperately to fit into a social circle of wealthy elites who secretly laughed at her behind her back. To keep up appearances, she needed money. She needed far more money than a mechanic could ever bring home, even working endless double shifts. She became the absolute financial manager of a household she secretly despised. She had total control over my pension, my life savings, and every single dollar I ever brought into that house. While I was laying on freezing concrete under the heavy hood of a freight truck, breathing in toxic fumes trying to secure our future, Valerie was using my blood money to play dress-up in Richard's arrogant world. She looked at my scarred, calloused hands and saw nothing but a bank account waiting to be drained. She looked at my absolute blind trust and saw a pathetic weakness to be exploited. I thought I was protecting my wife from the harsh realities of the world, but I was actually funding my own emotional execution. I handed her the exact weapons she would eventually use to leave me and our sweet, innocent granddaughter for dead. Every other Sunday, my own dining room was transformed into a hostile courtroom, where I was constantly put on trial for not being a wealthy man. Valerie insisted on hosting these lavish dinners to prove to her older sister Vivian that we were somehow keeping up with their elite, high society lifestyle. I would spend my entire weekend doing back-breaking yard work, power washing the concrete driveway perfectly, manicuring the front lawn, planting fresh flowers, and deep cleaning the patio, just to make sure everything was absolutely flawless for her guests. I wanted my wife to be happy. But the second Vivian and her husband, Richard Montgomery, pulled their imported silver Bentley into my driveway, the air in my home would turn ice cold. Richard would step out of his luxury car wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit to a simple Sunday family barbecue. He was a tall, imposing white American man who carried himself with the sickening arrogance of a king visiting his poorest peasants. He would walk through my front door, look at the wooden crown molding I installed with my own two bare hands, and give this tight little patronizing smile. He would wipe his expensive leather shoes on the welcome mat for just a few seconds too long, as if the very dust of my working-class neighborhood might infect his perfect life. Vivian would immediately kiss Valerie on both cheeks and hand her a bottle of imported wine that cost more than my first used pickup truck. They would glide right into the kitchen, completely taking over the space, while I was relegated to the corner, standing there like a hired butler in my own personal sanctuary. The real psychological torture always began the moment we all sat down at the dinner table. Richard absolutely loved holding court. He would swirl his expensive red wine in his crystal glass and launch into these long, winding, arrogant stories about his exclusive golf games with powerful state senators and his multi-million-dollar corporate mergers. He ran a massive healthcare insurance conglomerate, and he made sure every single person in the room knew exactly how much raw power he wielded over human lives. When he finally ran out of breath from bragging about his own greatness, he would turn his sharp, predatory blue eyes directly toward me. He never outright called me a complete failure. He was far too insidious and manipulative for that kind of honesty. Instead, he used the sharp weapon of subtle condescension to cut me down piece by piece. He would ask me how the dirty little truck garage was doing. He would make loud, performative sighs and say things like, "It is truly admirable how you wake up and do such grueling manual labor." Jerome, I could never imagine getting my own hands that filthy, but I suppose we all have our different stations in life. Vivian would giggle quietly behind her expensive linen napkin. And Valerie, my own wife, the woman whose entire comfortable lifestyle I funded with my broken back, would nod in absolute agreement with them. She would look at my clean but permanently calloused hands resting on the table and subtly shake her head in total disgust. Later that night, when the guests were gone and we were alone behind the closed wooden door of our master bedroom, she would hiss at me with genuine venom in her voice. She would call me embarrassing. She would tell me my vocabulary was too simple and my manners were too rough. She would say I lacked true ambition and that I needed to try much harder to impress Richard if we ever wanted to move up in the world. I swallowed the bitter, agonizing taste of that total disrespect every single time she spoke to me that way. I kept my mouth entirely shut. I forced a polite, warm smile at the dinner table and offered Richard another thick slice of brisket because I was raised by good people to believe that family is always family. I believed that real men absorb the heavy blows to keep the peace and harmony in their own household. I let them trample all over my pride and my dignity, because I thought my enduring silence was an act of profound, unconditional love. I thought I was protecting our marriage. I was a complete fool to endure that abuse. But the absolute worst part of those agonizing Sunday dinners was not how they treated me. I was a grown man. I could take the insults. The true tragedy was how they looked at my son, DeAndre. DeAndre has always been an incredibly quiet and deeply observant soul. He does not speak just to hear his own voice echo in a room. He sits back, he watches people closely, and he absorbs every single minute detail in his environment. He is a certified forensic accountant. He spends his long days tracking highly complex financial discrepancies, hunting down stolen hidden assets, and unraveling massive global webs of corporate fraud. He is brilliant in a terrifying, meticulous way that loud, arrogant men like Richard Montgomery simply cannot ever comprehend. Because DeAndre did not brag loudly about his annual salary or drive a flashy European sports car to the house, Richard treated him like a naive, helpless child. Richard would lean all the way across the dining table, aggressively cutting his expensive steak, and look at my brilliant son with profound, mocking pity. He would point his silver fork at DeAndre and say, "My boy, you cannot spend your whole entire life crunching boring little numbers in a gray cubicle for absolute pennies. Come work for my massive conglomerate. I can get you a low-level management position down in the corporate mailroom. It will be a real step up from whatever tiny spreadsheets you are looking at right now." Richard would laugh a booming, hollow, arrogant laugh, fully expecting everyone at the table to join in his cruel amusement. Vivian would immediately chime in, saying it was such a remarkably generous offer from her wealthy husband, and that DeAndre should be endlessly grateful for the charity. Valerie would reach her foot out and kick DeAndre hard under the wooden table, silently demanding that he smile and thank the arrogant man who was openly humiliating him in front of his own father. But DeAndre never flinched. He never broke his calm demeanor, not even once. He would just slowly and deliberately place his fork down on his porcelain plate, look directly into Richard's cold blue eyes, and give this incredibly faint, terrifyingly calm smile. He would politely decline the insulting job offer in a soft, perfectly even voice, saying he was quite satisfied with his current financial investigations. Richard thought DeAndre was weak and pathetic. He thought my son's respectful silence was a clear symptom of cowardice and low intelligence. He truly believed that because DeAndre did not puff out his chest and shout back, he was completely harmless. Richard made the fatal, arrogant flaw of assuming that a young black man with a quiet, peaceful demeanor was absolutely no threat to a wealthy, untouchable corporate titan. But I knew the absolute chilling truth. I knew my son better than anyone else on this earth. I saw the precise way DeAndre's dark eyes would carefully track Richard's every single movement. I saw the way his brilliant analytical mind was constantly working, categorizing every arrogant boast, every drunken slip of the tongue, and every casual, careless mention of Richard's hidden offshore banking accounts. DeAndre was not being submissive or weak. He was silently gathering vital data. He was building a comprehensive psychological and financial profile of a deeply corrupt, dangerous man. Underneath that calm, respectful exterior, my son possessed an intellect so sharp and so utterly ruthless it could easily cut through solid titanium. He was a human supercomputer wrapped in absolute, endless patience. Richard Montgomery sat comfortably at my dining table, eating the good food I paid for, and actively mocked the two men who would eventually become his absolute total undoing. He thought he was playing a fun little power game with a dumb, dirty mechanic and a weak, cowardly accountant. He never once realized that while he was busy laughing at us, treating us like dirt beneath his shoes, DeAndre was silently memorizing the exact structural blueprint of his entire fraudulent financial empire, just waiting for the perfect, agonizing moment to completely burn his entire world to the ground. The day my entire world collapsed into absolute ruin started out just like any other normal Tuesday. I was underneath the heavy chassis of a commercial freight truck, freezing on the greasy concrete floor of the garage. I was wrestling with a busted transmission covered in thick black oil and industrial grime. My joints were aching. My lower back was screaming in pain, but my mind was completely at peace. I was thinking about my beautiful 8-year-old granddaughter, Aaliyah. I had promised to take her for ice cream after school, and I was mentally calculating how fast I could scrub the grease off my hands so I would not be late. Then the heavy metal phone on the garage wall started ringing. The foreman answered it and shouted for me over the deafening roar of the air compressors. He said it was my son DeAndre, and that it was an absolute emergency. I wiped my hands on a dirty rag and grabbed the receiver. I will never in my entire life forget the sound of my son's voice in that agonizing moment. DeAndre is an incredibly stoic, composed man. He tracks complex financial fraud for a living, and his emotions are always perfectly controlled. But right then, his voice was trembling so violently he could barely form a coherent sentence. He told me Aaliyah had collapsed on the playground at school. She was not breathing right. The paramedics had rushed her to the pediatric intensive care unit at the main city hospital. I dropped the heavy steel wrench right there on the floor. I did not even tell my boss I was leaving. I ran out to my old pickup truck and I drove like a desperate madman, breaking every single traffic law in the city of Atlanta just to get to my family. Walking into that pediatric intensive care unit was like walking into a living nightmare. The walls were painted a sterile, depressing white, and the entire floor smelled like harsh bleach and lingering tragedy. There is a specific kind of silence in a children's hospital ward that is heavier than lead. It is the agonizing silence of parents praying to a God they hope is listening. I found DeAndre pacing the hallway outside a glass room. His dark eyes were wide with pure terror. I looked through the heavy glass window and saw my sweet, precious Aaliyah. The little girl who used to run to the front door and grab my calloused hands was now lying in a massive hospital bed hooked up to a dozen terrifying machines. There were tubes in her tiny arms and a massive monitor keeping track of her fragile heartbeat. We waited in that agonizing purgatory for hours. They ran every blood test, every brain scan, and every cellular biopsy they could possibly perform. Finally, a team of highly specialized doctors walked down the hallway. You can always tell when doctors are carrying a death sentence. They refuse to make eye contact and their faces turn into emotionless masks. The lead doctor ushered DeAndre and me into a tiny windowless consultation room. It was the kind of room designed specifically for breaking people's hearts. The doctor asked us to sit down, but my legs were shaking so badly I had to lean against the cold cinder block wall. The doctor looked at us and delivered a diagnosis that completely shattered our reality. He told us Aaliyah was suffering from an ultra-rare, highly aggressive genetic cellular deterioration. I am just a diesel mechanic, so I asked him to explain it to me in plain English. I asked him what was broken in her engine. He explained that a completely random microscopic mutation in her core DNA had suddenly activated. Her own cells were rapidly forgetting how to regenerate. Instead of building new healthy tissue, her body was actively attacking its own biological foundation. It was a rapid systemic failure. I asked the doctor how long it would take to fix it with medication or standard surgery. He looked down at his clipboard and said the timeline was not measured in years or even months. He told us we had a matter of weeks before her internal organs began to shut down entirely. I felt all the air leave the room. My chest tightened so hard I thought I was having a massive heart attack. I fell to my knees right there on the cheap hospital carpet. I grabbed the doctor's white coat and I begged him. I told him I was a strong, healthy man. I told him he could take my heart, my lungs, my liver, my blood. I told him to take every single organ in my body and put it into that little girl if it would save her life. I was ready to die right there on the floor so she could live. The doctor gently pulled me up and told me with profound sadness that medical science simply does not work that way. But then a tiny, agonizing glimmer of hope entered the room. The doctor hesitated for a moment, checking to see if the door was fully closed. He told us there was exactly one option left on the entire planet. It was not a standard procedure available at regular hospitals. It was a revolutionary, cutting-edge scientific miracle. He told us about a highly specialized United States research facility located on the West Coast that had successfully developed a customized CRISPR gene therapy surgery. They had the advanced technology to completely map Aaliyah's exact faulty genetic code. They could literally build a custom biological virus in a laboratory, inject it into her spinal fluid, and forcefully rewrite the corrupted DNA inside her body. The doctor told us that if she received this highly experimental surgery, she would not just survive. She would be completely cured. She would grow up, go to college, and live a long, totally normal life. The profound relief that washed over me was intoxicating. I looked at DeAndre and I saw the tears of joy welling up in his eyes. We had a solution. We had a path forward. I told the doctor to book the flight immediately. I told him to call the research facility and tell them we were coming right now. I told him I did not care if I had to drive the truck across the country myself. We were getting that surgery. But the doctor did not smile back at me. His face grew even darker. He took a deep, trembling breath and told us there was a massive, insurmountable obstacle. Because this was a highly customized, revolutionary procedure performed at a private, elite research institution, they required the funding to be fully secured in an escrow account before their scientists would even begin synthesizing the cure. The facility did not operate on charity. They operated on cold, hard cash. I puffed out my chest and told the doctor I had a house, a pension, and a truck to sell. I told him we would find the money. I asked him exactly how much this miracle surgery cost. The doctor looked me dead in the eyes and said the cost of the customized gene therapy, the specialized surgical team, and the required recovery protocols was exactly $20 million. $20 million. That number hit me so hard I physically staggered backward. $20 million is not a medical bill. It is an astronomical ransom demand placed on the head of an innocent child. It is a number so completely detached from the reality of a working-class family that it does not even sound like real money. It is an insult to every single drop of sweat I ever poured onto the floor of that mechanic garage. I worked 40 agonizing years, destroying my own physical body, and my entire life savings combined with the value of my home would barely cover a tiny fraction of that impossible number. I looked at the doctor, hoping he had made a terrible mistake, hoping he meant 200,000 or even 2 million. But he just slowly shook his head, confirming the absolute devastation. My son DeAndre did not collapse. While I was paralyzed by the sheer mathematical impossibility of saving my granddaughter, DeAndre immediately shifted into total analytical survival mode. He is a brilliant forensic accountant. He understands massive numbers, and he understands complex corporate systems better than anyone I know. DeAndre looked at the doctor and said, $20 million is fully covered by our premium family health insurance policy. DeAndre had a phenomenal corporate health plan through his accounting firm, and Aaliyah was listed as his primary dependent. The policy clearly stated it covered life-saving emergency procedures with absolutely no lifetime maximum limits. DeAndre opened his laptop right there in the miserable little consultation room. For the next 48 straight hours, my son did not sleep, eat, or even drink a drop of water. He sat in a rigid plastic chair next to Aaliyah's bed, compiling the most massive, comprehensive medical file I have ever seen. He gathered sworn testimonies from 5 different pediatric specialists. He pulled historical case studies proving the specific gene therapy had a 98% success rate. He built an impenetrable fortress of legal and medical evidence, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that this $20 million procedure was the absolute only way to save a human life. We submitted the massive emergency expedited claim to the primary insurance provider, and we waited. Waiting for a massive faceless corporation to decide if your child gets to live or die is a very specific kind of psychological torture. Every single minute that ticked by on the hospital wall clock felt like an entire agonizing year. I sat by Aaliyah's bed, holding her tiny, fragile hand while she slept heavily under the heavy medication. I prayed constantly. I begged the universe for absolute mercy. On the morning of the 3rd day, the notification finally arrived on DeAndre's laptop. I stood right behind his shoulder as he clicked open the secure portal from the insurance provider. I watched his dark eyes scan the official corporate letterhead. I watched my strong, brilliant son physically stop breathing. His face turned the color of cold ash. He did not say a single word. He just slowly turned the bright laptop screen toward me so I could read it for myself. The massive bold letters at the top of the official document burned directly into my retinas. Emergency claim categorically denied. I read the detailed explanation printed in cold, calculated legal jargon. The insurance corporation stated that because the customized CRISPR gene therapy was relatively new and performed at an independent research facility, they were officially classifying the $20 million procedure as experimental and non-essential. Non-essential. They looked at the fading heartbeat of a beautiful, innocent 8-year-old girl. They looked at a procedure that was guaranteed to cure her, and they legally classified her entire existence as non-essential. The pure righteous indignation that exploded inside my chest in that exact moment was blinding. It was not just deep sorrow anymore. It was a violent volcanic rage. A group of wealthy executives sitting in a luxurious air-conditioned boardroom had casually signed my granddaughter's absolute death warrant just to protect their precious quarterly profit margins. But DeAndre was not finished reading. His brilliant analytical mind immediately recognized the specific corporate formatting on the denial letter. The letterhead did not belong to his direct local insurance provider. The denial had been escalated to a massive national subsidiary holding company. DeAndre started typing furiously, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he traced the complex digital web of corporate ownership. He bypassed the public-facing websites and dug straight into the federal corporate registry databases. He traced the subsidiary to a regional management group, and then he traced that group straight up to the massive parent umbrella corporation. When the final parent company logo loaded onto the bright computer screen, the entire hospital room seemed to instantly freeze. The massive conglomerate that owned the subsidiary, the massive corporate machine that had just coldly denied the funds to save my granddaughter's precious life, was Montgomery Healthcare Solutions. It was the exact same company owned and controlled by my arrogant, wealthy brother-in-law, Richard Montgomery. The very same man who sat at my dining room table every other Sunday, drinking my expensive wine and mocking my calloused mechanic hands, was the absolute supreme ruler of the exact company that had just condemned my sweet Aaliyah to death. It was not a random automated corporate denial. It was a calculated financial execution orchestrated by the exact same monster who smiled at my wife over Sunday dinner. We were entirely at their mercy, and they had just coldly closed the heavy steel door on our only hope. When Valerie finally walked into the pediatric intensive care unit hours after my frantic phone call, she did not look like a grandmother whose own flesh and blood was fighting for her very life. She did not have red puffy eyes from crying in the car. Her expensive silk blouse was perfectly pressed, and her heavy gold jewelry clinked softly as she walked down the sterile hospital corridor. She looked exactly like a wealthy woman who had been mildly inconvenienced on her way to an upscale country club luncheon. I was standing outside the heavy glass door of the medical room watching the rhythmic rise and fall of my sweet little Aaliyah's chest. My heart was completely shattered into a million jagged pieces, but seeing my wife gave me a brief fleeting moment of hope. I thought the gravity of the situation would finally snap her out of her toxic obsession with money. I thought that looking at our dying granddaughter would remind her that we were a family, and that family always protects its own. I gently took her by the arm and guided her away from the busy hallway and into the small private family waiting room at the end of the intensive care ward. I closed the heavy wooden door behind us to block out the agonizing beeps of the medical monitors. I looked her dead in the eyes and I told her everything. I told her about the ultra-rare genetic cellular deterioration. I told her about the miraculous customized gene therapy surgery on the West Coast that was absolutely guaranteed to save our sweet girl's life. And then with a heavy trembling voice, I told her about the astronomical $20 million price tag and the cold calculated denial we had just received from her brother-in-law's massive insurance conglomerate. I expected her to gasp. I expected her to break down in tears and curse Richard's name for denying our precious Aaliyah the funds she needed to live. But Valerie just stood there perfectly still. Her face was an unreadable mask of cold stone. I grabbed her soft manicured hands with my rough calloused fingers, and I started pleading with the desperate manic energy of a drowning man. I told her we had to act right this very second. I laid out my entire frantic plan. I told her to call our real estate agent immediately and list our beautiful suburban house for a cash buyer at a massive discount. I told her I was going to call the union representative and liquidate every single penny of the pension I had spent 40 brutal years building on the greasy concrete floors of the mechanic garage. I said we would drain the joint savings accounts, sell my heavy-duty truck, sell her imported luxury car, and take out every single massive personal loan the banks would legally approve. I told her I would gladly work double shifts until the day my physical heart gave out if it meant our granddaughter got to take another breath. I laid my entire life, my past, my present, and my future right there at her expensive leather shoes. Valerie slowly pulled her hands out of my desperate grip. She took a step back and smoothed out an invisible wrinkle on her designer silk blouse. The temperature in that small hospital waiting room seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single second. She looked at me not with the profound sorrow of a grieving grandmother, but with the absolute cold disgust of a corporate auditor looking at a terrible business proposal. She let out a heavy, annoyed sigh. She told me to lower my voice and stop acting like a hysterical child. She said my frantic plan was completely pathetic and mathematically impossible. She coldly reminded me that even if we sold the house and emptied my blue-collar pension, it would barely cover a fraction of a $20 million medical bill. I told her it did not matter. I told her it was a start, and that we could use the cash to hire a ruthless attorney to legally force Richard's insurance company to pay the rest of the balance. The moment I mentioned Richard's name, her eyes hardened into black, icy stones. She defended him immediately. She told me Richard was running a global business, not a charity ward, and that his corporate decisions were strictly financial. I could not believe the absolute poison coming out of my own wife's mouth. I pointed a shaking finger toward the glass window where our son DeAndre was sitting beside his dying daughter. I told her this was not a business transaction. This was our blood. This was the little girl who called her grandma. Valerie walked over to the small window in the waiting room door and looked out down the hallway toward Aaliyah's room. She watched the nurses adjusting the heavy tubes connected to our granddaughter's tiny, fragile body. I waited for the maternal instinct to finally kick in. I waited for the heavy armor of her high society obsession to crack and reveal the woman I had married 35 years ago. Instead, Valerie turned her head and looked right through me. Her face was totally devoid of human empathy. She looked at the hospital room. She looked at me. And she delivered a sentence so incredibly evil, it will echo in my nightmares until the day I am put into the ground. She said I am not going broke for a lost cause. The sheer devastating force of those exact words physically knocked the wind completely out of my lungs. I stumbled backward and hit the cold cinder block wall. A lost cause. She was talking about an innocent 8-year-old girl who loved her unconditionally. She was talking about her own flesh and blood. Before my brain could even process the absolute pure wickedness of her statement, Valerie reached down and calmly picked up her heavy designer leather purse. She adjusted the thick strap over her shoulder. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She did not shed a single microscopic tear. She just turned her back on me, opened the waiting room door, and walked right out. I stood there paralyzed, listening to the sharp rhythmic clicking of her expensive heels fading away down the sterile hospital corridor. She was abandoning us in our darkest hour. She was choosing her wealthy, comfortable lifestyle over the life of her dying granddaughter. The sheer, blinding rage and absolute panic inside my chest finally forced my legs to move. I realized that if she was walking away, I had to take total control of our finances immediately. I had to secure my retirement funds and our life savings before she tried to freeze the joint accounts out of pure spite. I practically ran out of the hospital, bursting through the sliding glass doors into the blinding Georgia heat. I got into my old rusted pickup truck and drove like a maniac straight to the local bank branch where we had kept our money for over 3 decades. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely put the truck into park. I ran into the quiet, air-conditioned bank lobby and marched straight up to the head teller's counter. I slapped my worn driver's license down on the polished marble and demanded to see the current balances of every single joint savings and checking account under our names. I told the teller I needed to begin the emergency process of massive wire transfers for a life-saving medical procedure. The older woman behind the counter smiled kindly at me and began typing my information into her computer terminal. I stood there tapping my heavy work boots on the floor, praying we had enough liquid cash to at least pay for a legal retainer to fight the insurance company. The teller's friendly smile slowly vanished. Her eyes widened as she scrolled down the bright computer screen. She started clicking her mouse frantically, trying to refresh the financial page. She looked up at me with genuine, deep concern and confusion. She asked me if I was absolutely sure I had the right account numbers. I told her I had been banking there since before she was born and to just tell me the exact balance. The teller took a deep, uncomfortable breath and turned the heavy monitor around so I could see the screen for myself. Every single account was completely at zero. The checking account was zero. The massive joint savings account that held 40 years of my blood, sweat, and overtime mechanic pay was absolutely entirely empty. My vision blurred and the edges of the bank lobby started to spin. I grabbed the edge of the marble counter to keep from collapsing onto the floor. I demanded to know where my money went. I demanded to know if the bank had made a catastrophic error. The teller quietly printed out a stack of recent transaction receipts and handed them to me with trembling hands. I stared at the black ink on the white paper and felt my entire soul shatter into dust. The accounts had not been emptied today. They had been systematically drained over the past several weeks through a series of complex wire transfers authorized solely by Valerie. Every single penny of my life savings had been routed into a private offshore holding account that I did not have legal access to. She had completely robbed me blind while I was busy working under the hoods of freight trucks trying to provide for her. A sudden, terrifying thought violently struck my brain. If she took the liquid cash, what else did she take? I pulled out my cell phone and frantically dialed my old friend who worked down at the county property records office. I gave him my home address and begged him to look up the current legal deed. I stood in the corner of that quiet bank lobby, sweating profusely while I listened to him typing on his keyboard. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with pity. He told me that 3 weeks ago my wife Valerie had legally transferred the entire deed of our family home using a power of attorney clause I had foolishly signed years ago, thinking it was just standard estate planning. I asked him who owned my house now. He read the name of the new legal owner. It was a private corporate LLC directly registered to Richard Montgomery. Valerie had not just walked out on us today. This cold-blooded walkout had been meticulously planned for months. She had secretly sold the very roof over my head to her wealthy, arrogant brother-in-law. She had stolen every single dollar of my retirement. She had left me with absolutely nothing but the dirty mechanic clothes on my back and an old rusted truck. I was completely and utterly ruined. I was a 68-year-old man who had played by the rules, worked hard his entire life, and loved his wife unconditionally, only to be completely financially gutted and left for dead on the side of the road. I drove back to the hospital in a state of absolute catatonic shock. The sun was starting to set over Atlanta, casting long, dark shadows across the medical campus. I walked back into the pediatric intensive care unit, feeling like a hollow ghost. I found my brilliant, quiet son, DeAndre, sitting in the exact same plastic chair next to Aaliyah's bed. He looked up at me with exhausted, desperate eyes, waiting for me to tell him I had secured the money, waiting for his strong father to save the day, just like I always did when he was growing up. I walked over to him, and I placed my heavy, calloused hand on his shoulder. I could not even look him in the eye. I stared at the cold hospital floor, and I told him the absolute agonizing truth. I told him his mother was gone, and she was never coming back. I told him the savings were entirely gone, and our family home belonged to the exact same arrogant monster who had just denied his daughter's medical claim. I told him we were completely destitute. For the first time in his entire adult life, my strong, stoic son completely broke down. DeAndre buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook violently as he wept in the agonizing silence of that terrible room. I pulled a second hard plastic hospital chair right next to him and sat down. My joints ached. My back was screaming, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the complete devastation in my heart. We had no house to go back to. We had no money to buy food. We were reduced to absolute beggars, sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs under harsh fluorescent lights. All we could do was sit there totally helpless, watching the medical monitors slowly tick away the precious remaining time we had left with our beautiful girl. We watched Aaliyah slowly fade deeper into her heavy, medicated sleep. The machines beeped in the cold, sterile room, mocking our complete poverty and our profound inability to save her. Valerie and Richard had taken my money, my home, and my pride. They thought they had completely broken us into total submission. They thought DeAndre and I were just collateral damage in their twisted, greedy games. But as I sat in that miserable plastic chair holding my weeping son's shoulder, the crushing despair slowly began to harden into something else entirely. It hardened into a cold, quiet, and absolutely terrifying righteous indignation. They had left us with absolutely nothing to lose. And a brilliant man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous force on the face of the earth. I had to leave the hospital for just a few hours. I had been wearing the exact same oil-stained mechanic clothes for 3 agonizing days. I smelled like dried sweat and stale hospital coffee. DeAndre absolutely refused to leave Aaliyah's side, so I told him I would drive back to the house just to grab us some clean underwear, a few toothbrushes, and whatever basic clothes I could shove into a duffel bag. Driving my rusted pickup truck back into my own suburban neighborhood felt like entering a completely foreign country. The beautiful wide street lined with tall oak trees and perfectly manicured lawns used to fill my chest with so much pride. Now it just made me violently sick to my stomach. I pulled into the concrete driveway I had personally poured and power washed 100 times. I looked at the front door of the massive house that legally belonged to my arrogant brother-in-law, Richard Montgomery now. I put my old metal key into the brass lock, praying it still worked. It clicked open. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. The silence in that house was absolutely deafening. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the chilling, heavy silence of a freshly dug grave. I walked into the grand foyer and looked around the space I used to call my sanctuary. Valerie had not just packed a quick weekend bag. She had completely gutted the place of anything truly valuable. The expensive imported vases were totally gone. The silver picture frames that used to hold our family photos had been emptied and left carelessly on the expensive hardwood floor. She took the valuable silver frames, but she dumped the paper photos of my son and my granddaughter directly into the kitchen trash can. That visual alone felt like a physical knife twisting deep into my ribs. I walked up the carpeted stairs, feeling like a criminal trespasser in the very home I broke my own back to build. I went straight into the master bedroom. Valerie's massive walk-in closet was completely bare. All her designer dresses, her expensive silk blouses, and her hundreds of imported leather shoes were completely gone. The only things left hanging in that massive space were my cheap, heavy-duty work shirts and my stiff denim jeans. She had meticulously packed her entire luxurious life into expensive leather suitcases and had a professional moving company haul it all away while I was sitting in a hospital chair begging God to save my granddaughter's life. I grabbed an old canvas duffel bag from the top shelf and started throwing my simple clothes into it. I needed to move fast before I completely broke down and lost my mind. I went over to her heavy oak vanity desk to look for an extra phone charger. I pulled the bottom drawer open entirely too hard, and it completely fell off the metal tracks, crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. A pile of old discarded junk spilled out everywhere. Empty perfume bottles, discarded makeup compacts, and crumpled store receipts scattered across the wood. But right there, underneath a stack of old heavy fashion magazines, I saw a sleek black rectangular shape. It was an old electronic tablet. Valerie used to carry it around everywhere a few years ago before she upgraded to the newest, most expensive model available. The screen had a tiny crack in the top corner, and it looked completely dead. Most wealthy people would have just kicked it into the trash pile with the rest of her discarded junk. But a strange cold instinct washed over my entire body in that exact moment. I am a heavy diesel mechanic by trade. I know that when a massive, complex machine suddenly breaks down, the most important vital clues are always found in the leftover broken parts the operator tried to throw away. I picked up the cold glass tablet and shoved it deep into the bottom of my canvas duffel bag underneath my folded work shirts. I did not know what was on it, but I knew Valerie was incredibly careless when it came to managing her old electronics. I zipped up the heavy bag, walked out of that massive empty house, and locked the front door for the absolute final time. I drove back to the pediatric intensive care unit as fast as my old truck could legally go. The sun had completely set, and the hospital corridors were dimmed for the long, quiet night. I walked back into Aaliyah's sterile room and handed DeAndre a clean shirt and a fresh toothbrush. He took them with a completely hollow, devastating expression. He was fading incredibly fast. The crushing weight of our total poverty and his daughter's ticking biological clock was slowly destroying his brilliant mind. I knew I had to give him a specific analytical task to keep him anchored to reality. I reached deep into the canvas duffel bag, pulled out the cracked black tablet, and placed it gently on the small plastic table right next to his glowing laptop. I told him I found it hidden at the absolute bottom of his mother's vanity drawer. I told him it was completely dead, but that maybe, just maybe, there was some kind of hidden financial document or an old bank statement saved on it that could help us track down our stolen money. The exact moment DeAndre looked at that cracked digital screen, his entire physical posture completely changed. The profound weeping sorrow vanished from his dark, tired eyes and was instantly replaced by the terrifying cold focus of a master investigator. DeAndre is not just an accountant who pushes basic numbers around on a corporate spreadsheet. He is a high-level forensic investigator who has spent his entire professional career dismantling complex digital fortresses. He pulled a specialized charging cable from his heavy computer bag and plugged the dead tablet directly into his powerful laptop. We sat there in absolute agonizing silence for 10 long minutes, watching the tiny battery icon slowly blink back to life. When the screen finally lit up bright blue, it asked for a 6-digit numerical passcode. Valerie always thought she was so incredibly clever, but DeAndre knew her better than she knew herself. He knew she was fundamentally arrogant and creatively lazy. He did not even hesitate for a single second. He typed in the exact birth date of her arrogant brother-in-law, Richard Montgomery. The screen instantly unlocked. We leaned in close, staring at the bright digital screen. I thought we were going to find a few hidden credit card statements, or maybe an old angry email complaining about my dirty mechanic clothes. I was absolutely not prepared for the pure, concentrated evil that was waiting for us inside that machine. DeAndre bypassed the basic photo albums and went straight into the core hidden file directory. He opened a locked folder titled Personal Management. What we found inside that digital folder made my large calloused hands start to violently tremble with a righteous indignation so powerful it almost knocked me completely out of my plastic hospital chair. We did not find the panicked, sloppy tracks of a frightened woman running away from massive medical debt. We found a meticulously calculated, flawlessly executed 5-year exit strategy. Valerie had not made a split-second emotional decision to abandon us in the hospital waiting room earlier that day. She had been actively planning our complete financial and emotional execution for half a decade. DeAndre began opening digital document after digital document. The screen was absolutely filled with hundreds of synchronized calendar notes, encrypted text message logs, and scanned legal contracts. We saw the exact date 5 years ago when she secretly opened the hidden offshore bank account using a dummy corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. We found massive detailed spreadsheets where she had slowly and systematically siphoned exactly 15% of my heavy mechanic paychecks every single month, deliberately keeping the stolen amounts just low enough so I would never notice the missing funds. She had created fake utility bills and fabricated massive home repair invoices to perfectly justify where the money was going. While I was working brutal double weekend shifts to pay for a broken water heater that never actually broke, Valerie was transferring my blood money directly into her secret elite escape fund. But the financial theft was not even the most sickening part of the discovery. DeAndre opened a series of private journal entries she had typed out during her lavish country club lunches. She wrote in extensive, agonizing detail about how absolutely disgusted she was by my blue-collar lifestyle. She called me a pathetic, dirty pack mule. She wrote that staying married to me was a necessary, agonizing prison sentence she had to endure just long enough to drain my maximum retirement pension. She completely laid out her master plan to legally transfer the deed of our family home over to Richard's corporate holding company the exact moment my pension fully matured. She had literally circled a specific date on her digital calendar 6 months from now as her official permanent extraction day. Then DeAndre clicked on a specific folder labeled Family Obligations. I felt a cold, sharp knot twist deep inside my stomach. I watched my son's brilliant eyes scan the digital text. His breathing completely stopped. He clicked on a series of text messages between Valerie and her sister Vivian. The timestamps were from exactly 3 weeks ago, right when Aaliyah first started showing the early terrifying symptoms of her genetic condition, and we were scheduling the initial doctor appointments. Valerie had texted Vivian saying that the sick child was going to become a massive financial drain on the family resources. She actually complained that Aaliyah's medical tests were going to delay her permanent move to the luxury estate Richard had secretly purchased for her. She called her own granddaughter's failing health an annoying temporary inconvenience. She wrote to Vivian saying she needed to accelerate the final asset transfers immediately before the hospital started demanding heavy copays. She intentionally let us walk into that massive $20 million medical trap completely blind while she secured the very last of my life savings. She knew Aaliyah was dying, and she used that agonizing distraction as the perfect, convenient smokescreen to finally pull the trigger on her 5-year exit strategy. She left us holding the absolute heaviest bag of sorrow and debt imaginable, while she practically danced away with every single penny I ever earned. The righteous indignation that boiled up inside my heavy chest was completely overwhelming. I wanted to scream until my lungs physically tore apart. I wanted to smash that bright electronic screen into a million jagged glass pieces. I had spent 40 entire years of my life loving a woman who was actively treating me like a disposable sacrificial lamb. I had destroyed my knees, my lower back, and my precious youth for a total monster who was silently counting down the days until she could leave my family absolutely destitute. I looked over at DeAndre, fully expecting him to completely lose his mind. I expected him to throw the heavy computer across the sterile hospital room and scream out to the heavens in pure agony. But my son did not scream. He did not cry anymore. The weeping, broken father from an hour ago was completely gone. In his place sat a remarkably cold, terrifyingly calm machine. DeAndre slowly reached out and touched the bright digital screen. His dark eyes were reflecting the harsh blue light of the digital evidence. He had spent his entire adult life hunting down arrogant white-collar criminals who thought they were entirely untouchable. He had dismantled massive corporate frauds perpetrated by greedy billionaires. And now the absolute greatest financial crime he had ever witnessed was sitting right in his own lap, committed by his own mother and her arrogant billionaire brother-in-law. The sheer volume of raw data Valerie had carelessly left behind was an absolute goldmine. She thought she was so incredibly smart by wiping her main computer and taking all her physical paper files. She never once considered that the cloud synchronization on her discarded broken tablet would create a perfect, permanent digital map of her entire criminal conspiracy. She had essentially handed the most brilliant forensic accountant in the state of Georgia the exact detailed blueprint needed to completely destroy her. I sat back in my hard plastic chair, my massive calloused hands still trembling with pure rage, and I watched my quiet, gentle son go to war. DeAndre cracked his knuckles, took a slow, deep breath, and began downloading every single piece of that digital poison directly into his secure, encrypted servers. The agonizing sorrow in that hospital room had officially evaporated. It was instantly replaced by the terrifying, silent promise of absolute catastrophic justice. To truly understand the absolute depth of the pure evil we were dealing with, you have to understand exactly what my brilliant son DeAndre uncovered on that cracked digital tablet. He did not stop his investigation after finding the personal journals and the basic financial spreadsheets. His fingers flew across the keyboard of his powerful laptop, diving much deeper into the dark digital labyrinth Valerie had carelessly left behind. He found a heavily encrypted hidden folder labeled simply with the letter R. It was protected by a complex security firewall that would have kept any normal person completely locked out forever. But DeAndre is not a normal person. He is a master forensic accountant who spends his entire life breaking down the complex digital walls built by greedy, arrogant criminals. It took him less than 20 minutes to completely shatter the encryption and pull the raw data directly onto his bright computer screen. What we found inside that hidden folder was a massive archive of direct private email correspondence between my wife Valerie and her wealthy, arrogant brother-in-law, Richard Montgomery. I pulled my hard plastic hospital chair right next to DeAndre, and we began reading the digital letters one by one. I expected to find the usual toxic gossip or maybe some snobby complaints about my working-class lifestyle. I was entirely unprepared for the absolute pure, unadulterated evil that was waiting for us in plain black and white text. The very first email thread we opened was dated just 2 days ago. It was the exact same day Aaliyah had collapsed and the doctors had desperately submitted the massive $20 million medical claim to Richard's healthcare insurance conglomerate. I remembered sitting in this very same sterile hospital room praying to God for a miracle while waiting for the insurance approval. The subject line of the email from Richard was marked Urgent Claim Intercept. I read the words on the glowing screen and I felt all the blood physically drain out of my face. It was not a faceless corporate committee that had denied the life-saving funds for my granddaughter. It was Richard himself. He had set up a special digital alert in his massive corporate system, specifically flagging any major insurance claims filed under DeAndre's name. The exact moment our desperate $20 million request hit his corporate servers, Richard personally manually intervened. He sent a direct order to his executive board, commanding them to instantly stamp the claim as experimental and non-essential. He literally played God with my sweet little granddaughter's life, signing her absolute death warrant with a single keystroke from his air-conditioned corner office. But the absolute most agonizing question was why? Why would a man who is already worth hundreds of millions of dollars go out of his way to actively murder his own niece's child? The answer to that terrifying question was buried deep in the older emails stretching back over the last 5 years. DeAndre started opening the massive financial attachments Richard had sent to Valerie, and the entire sickening conspiracy finally came into the harsh, blinding light. Richard was not just a greedy corporate CEO, he was a massive criminal fraud. His shiny, untouchable healthcare conglomerate was actually a rapidly sinking ship built on an ocean of lies. DeAndre opened a series of internal accounting ledgers Richard had foolishly shared with Valerie. The ledgers proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that for the past decade, Richard had been systematically embezzling millions upon millions of dollars directly from the private medical trust funds of his most vulnerable sick patients. He was stealing the life-saving money meant for dying people and secretly funneling it into his own massive offshore bank accounts to fund his extravagant luxury lifestyle and keep his failing company artificially afloat. But Richard had a massive problem. He could not just move millions of dollars of dirty, stolen corporate money across international borders without triggering massive federal audits from the government. He needed a completely clean, untraceable financial mule to wash the money for him. He needed someone with a totally spotless middle-class background who could slowly and quietly filter the stolen funds through domestic accounts before wiring them overseas. That is exactly where my wife Valerie entered his dark, twisted picture. I read an email from Valerie dated 4 years ago, where she explicitly agreed to become Richard's personal money launderer. My hands began to shake with a violent, righteous indignation as I read the precise details of their sickening arrangement. Every single month, Richard would secretly deposit chunks of his stolen corporate money into the joint savings accounts I shared with Valerie. Then Valerie would mix his dirty money together with the clean, hard-earned money from my heavy blue-collar paychecks. She used the blood and sweat from my 40 years of manual labor as the perfect camouflage for Richard's massive corporate crimes. She would then bundle all the money together and wire it out to the secret offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands under the disguise of standard retirement investments. And what did my wife get for selling her soul and risking federal prison? She got a 20% cut of every single dollar she successfully washed. That was her massive secret escape fund. The luxury designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, and the elite country club memberships she constantly flaunted were all paid for with the stolen life savings of sick, dying people. I had spent my entire adult life destroying my knees and my back on freezing concrete garage floors, proudly believing I was providing an honest, honorable life for my family. In reality, I was completely blind. My own wife was using my honest, blue-collar name to launder dirty money for an arrogant billionaire monster. The sheer profound betrayal of that discovery was enough to completely shatter a man's mind. But the absolute worst was still yet to come. DeAndre clicked on a flagged email thread marked highly confidential. The timestamp was from yesterday morning, just hours before Valerie walked into the pediatric intensive care unit, grabbed her expensive leather purse, and coldly abandoned us for good. The email was a direct response from Valerie to Richard regarding Aaliyah's terminal diagnosis and the $20 million customized gene therapy surgery. I stared at the bright blue screen, and I read the exact words my wife had typed with her own two hands. I will never, as long as I live, forget the sheer venomous poison of that specific message. Valerie wrote to Richard telling him that the $20 million medical claim was actually a massive blessing in disguise. She told him that Aaliyah's sudden terminal illness was the perfect, convenient financial reset they had been waiting for. A convenient financial reset. She was talking about the agonizing death of an innocent 8-year-old girl who loved her unconditionally. Valerie explained her sick, twisted logic in complete detail. She told Richard that if they allowed the hospital to perform the surgery, and Aaliyah actually lived, it would create a massive, unending financial burden. DeAndre would be tied down with years of expensive physical therapy and massive medical debt. She knew that as a grandmother, society would expect her to stay and help care for the sick child. It would completely ruin her meticulously planned exit strategy. But if they just let the insurance claim die, Aaliyah would die with it. She wrote that without the child anchoring DeAndre to Atlanta, there would be absolutely no reason for Valerie to pretend to be a loving grandmother anymore. She could finally serve me with the absolute clean divorce papers she had been holding on to for years. She could completely cut all ties with my dirty working-class life and immediately move into the massive multi-million-dollar luxury estate Richard had already purchased for her under a fake corporate name in Florida. I felt a cold, blinding rage completely overtake my entire physical body. I had to grip the sides of my plastic hospital chair so hard my knuckles turned pure white just to stop myself from picking up the heavy metal oxygen tank and throwing it straight through the thick glass window. They did not just casually abandon us because they were scared of going broke. They actively and intentionally conspired to let my beautiful, innocent granddaughter die because her tragic death was financially convenient for their luxury lifestyle. They viewed her precious beating heart as an annoying obstacle standing between them and their stolen millions. Richard intervened to deny the medical claim because paying $20 million would have exposed his massive embezzlement scheme to the federal auditors. Valerie happily agreed to let her own flesh and blood suffocate to death in a sterile hospital bed because she wanted to drink expensive champagne on a private beach without any heavy family obligations tying her down. They were totally absolute monsters wearing expensive silk clothes and custom-tailored Italian suits. I slowly turned my head and looked away from the glowing computer screen. I looked through the dim lighting of the pediatric intensive care room at my sweet Aaliyah. She looked so incredibly small, buried under the heavy white hospital blankets. The massive medical machines beeped in a slow, agonizing rhythm, keeping track of the precious little time she had left on this earth. She was completely defenseless against the absolute pure evil that had targeted her. Her own grandmother had essentially placed a suffocating pillow over her face and smiled while doing it. I looked back at DeAndre. The agonizing sorrow that had completely broken him earlier today was entirely gone. His dark eyes were locked onto the digital screen, but they were completely devoid of tears. He was reading the exact same sickening words I was reading, but his brilliant mind was already moving 1,000 steps ahead. He was memorizing every single offshore account number, every single fake corporate routing code, and every single piece of digital evidence proving Richard's massive healthcare fraud and Valerie's disgusting money laundering operation. The truth was finally unveiled, and it was more horrifying than my absolute worst nightmares. Valerie and Richard thought they had completely won. They thought they had successfully destroyed a weak-old mechanic and his quiet, helpless son. They thought they could just murder a child through corporate bureaucracy and simply walk away to live in total luxury. They severely underestimated the absolute terrifying power of a father's unconditional love and the cold, brilliant vengeance of a son who has just lost absolutely everything. They gave us the exact rope they used to hang us, and now we were going to use it to drag them straight down into the darkest pits of hell. The righteous indignation burning inside my chest hardened into an unbreakable, solid iron resolve. I was no longer just a grieving grandfather begging for a miracle. I was a man preparing for absolute total war. Any normal man who just discovered that his own wife and his wealthy, arrogant brother-in-law had actively conspired to murder his innocent granddaughter would have completely lost his mind right then and there. I should have stood up from that hard plastic hospital chair and screamed until the blood vessels in my neck physically burst. I should have picked up the heavy metal oxygen tank resting in the corner of the room and smashed it straight through the thick glass window of the intensive care unit. I should have marched right out of those sliding hospital doors, driven my rusted pickup truck directly to Richard's multi-million-dollar estate, and beaten that monster within an absolute inch of his miserable life, with my bare, calloused hands. That is exactly what the burning righteous indignation in my heavy chest was screaming at me to do. But I did not scream. I did not beg the universe for mercy, and I absolutely did not cry another single tear. When you are pushed entirely past the absolute limits of human suffering, a very strange and terrifying silence takes over your entire physical body. It is the absolute freezing cold silence of a man who realizes that crying loudly will not save his family. Only absolute total destruction will. I sat back heavily in my chair and I watched my son DeAndre. I watched a profound and terrifying transformation take place right in front of my very eyes. For his entire life, DeAndre had been a remarkably gentle, quiet soul. He was a man who always spoke softly, avoided foolish conflicts, and kept his head down buried deep in his accounting spreadsheets. Richard and Valerie had always looked at my son and seen a weak, pathetic coward. Richard thought that because DeAndre did not brag loudly or puff out his chest at the Sunday dinner table, he was completely harmless. But what Richard completely failed to understand in his massive, blinding arrogance was that still water always runs the absolute deepest. DeAndre was not a coward by any stretch of the imagination. He was a highly trained master of silent observation. He was a certified high-level forensic accountant who spent his long days hunting down the most ruthless, wealthy, white-collar criminals on the face of the planet. And sitting there in the dim blue light of his laptop screen, watching his only daughter fight for her final breaths, my son transformed from a weeping, broken father into an absolute apex predator. The agonizing sorrow entirely left his dark, tired eyes, replaced by a cold, mechanical calculation that sent a shiver straight down my own spine. He did not look like a helpless victim anymore. He looked like the absolute violent wrath of God, wrapped in a cheap hospital blanket. I leaned over the small plastic table and whispered to him. I asked him if we should take the cracked digital tablet straight to the local police or call the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. I told him we had the absolute, undeniable proof of massive corporate embezzlement and domestic money laundering right there on the screen. DeAndre slowly shook his head without ever taking his eyes off the bright digital glow of his powerful computer. He explained the harsh, brutal reality of the American legal justice system to me. If we went to the local police, they would have to file a massive, complex report that would take weeks just to process. It would take even more agonizing weeks just to get a federal judge to sign a warrant to legally search Richard's offshore servers. Richard had enough dirty stolen money to hire a massive army of the most expensive, ruthless corporate defense lawyers in the entire country. He would tie the case up in federal court for years, completely freezing all the stolen assets in a long, drawn-out legal battle. And while the wealthy lawyers argued comfortably in their expensive, air-conditioned courtrooms, my sweet little Aaliyah would slowly suffocate to death in this sterile hospital bed. The massive medical machines hooked up to her tiny, fragile body were loudly reminding us that we did not have years or months or even weeks. We had a matter of days before her internal organs completely shut down forever. The police could eventually give us cold revenge, but they absolutely could not give us the $20 million we desperately needed right this very second to fund the customized gene therapy surgery. We did not need the slow-turning, rusty wheels of the justice system. We needed an instantaneous financial execution. DeAndre cracked his knuckles, took a slow, deep breath, and went straight to work. What my son did next was the most brilliant, beautiful, and utterly terrifying display of intellectual warfare I have ever witnessed in my 68 years on this earth. He did not operate like a common criminal hacker breaking through digital windows in the dark. That is what foolish amateur thieves do. DeAndre used his incredibly high-level forensic security clearance to legally walk right through the open front doors of Richard's massive corporate framework. As a senior forensic investigator, DeAndre had legally authorized federal access to the deepest corporate registry databases and complex international banking routing systems. He started running Richard's massive healthcare insurance conglomerate through his highly specialized financial tracking software. I am just an old diesel mechanic who spent his life up to his elbows in thick grease, so DeAndre had to explain it to me in mechanical terms I could easily understand. He told me that Richard's massive financial empire was built exactly like a terrible faulty engine block. On the outside, it looked shiny, perfectly polished, and incredibly powerful. But underneath the heavy steel hood, it was a massive tangled mess of illegal bypasses, leaking hoses, and poorly hidden structural failures. Richard had built dozens of fake shell companies and hidden domestic trust funds across the globe to hide his stolen corporate money. But because Richard was fundamentally arrogant, he was also fundamentally lazy. He truly believed he was completely untouchable, like a living god among men, so he had arrogantly reused the exact same corporate attorneys and the exact same hidden digital signatures for all his illegal offshore accounts. I sat there absolutely mesmerized as I watched my quiet son dismantle a billionaire in real time. DeAndre's fingers flew across the keyboard at a blinding speed, pulling up massive legal documents, offshore banking charters, and heavily redacted tax filings. He traced the exact digital path of the dirty money Valerie had been systematically laundering for the past 5 years. He watched the digital footprints of the money flow from my honest blue-collar bank account straight into a massive corporate holding trust registered in the Cayman Islands. Richard had officially named the massive offshore trust the Montgomery Global Relief Fund. It was a sick, twisted, arrogant joke. He used a word like relief to hide the exact money he was ruthlessly stealing from dying, vulnerable patients. DeAndre bypassed the basic financial ledgers and downloaded the entire foundational legal charter of the offshore trust. He started reading through hundreds of pages of dense, suffocating corporate legal jargon. He was hunting for a specific structural weakness. He was looking for the exact digital pressure point where he could insert a legal blade and bleed Richard's entire corrupt empire completely dry in a matter of seconds. For 6 straight, agonizing hours, the absolute only sound in that freezing cold hospital room was the rhythmic, heavy beep of Aaliyah's heart monitor and the rapid-fire clicking of DeAndre's keyboard. The sun began to slowly rise over the city of Atlanta, casting a pale gray light through the intensive care window. DeAndre suddenly stopped typing. His hands hovered completely frozen over the keys. He leaned his face just inches away from the bright computer screen. A slow, terrifying smile began to spread across my son's exhausted face. It was not a smile of joy. It was the exact chilling smile of a brilliant patient hunter who has just locked the heavy steel cage shut around his absolute worst enemy. He slowly turned his head to look at me and pointed his finger at a specific paragraph buried deep within the 200th page of Richard's offshore corporate charter. DeAndre had found it. He had found the absolute fatal flaw in Richard's massive illegal engine. DeAndre explained the massive discovery to me in a quiet, trembling voice. When arrogant billionaires like Richard set up these massive illegal offshore accounts to hide their stolen money, they are constantly terrified of being audited by the federal government or international tax agencies. To make the massive offshore trust look like a perfectly legitimate charitable organization, Richard and his expensive lawyers had legally registered the account as a philanthropic healthcare initiative. But to fully qualify for the absolute highest tier of international tax immunity and keep the government auditors completely blind, they had to include a very specific legal provision inside the corporate charter. It was a dormant legal clause called the Emergency Philanthropic Dispersal Protocol. DeAndre broke the complex legal terminology down for me step by absolute step. He told me that this specific clause was designed to act as a massive legal shield. If the international banking authorities ever came knocking on Richard's massive front door demanding to know why he was hoarding tens of millions of dollars in a supposedly charitable trust, Richard could just point directly to this exact clause. The clause legally stated that in the event of an immediate catastrophic medical emergency involving a direct family member of any corporate shareholder, the trust was legally bound to instantly liquidate its assets and disperse the required medical funds directly to the attending medical facility. It was a fake safety valve. Richard put it in the charter purely for show to look like a generous philanthropist. He never in a million years actually intended to use it. It was just fancy, complex legal window dressing to keep the federal tax auditors entirely off his back while he enjoyed his stolen wealth. But Richard had made one massive catastrophic mistake when he arrogant wrote that fake clause. He was so incredibly arrogant and so completely blinded by his own insatiable greed that he completely failed to secure the legal authorization protocols. The clause explicitly stated that any legally recognized direct family member could independently trigger the emergency dispersal if they provided absolute undeniable medical proof of a life-threatening condition. I looked at DeAndre and the massive realization hit me so hard I felt like I had been struck by a runaway freight truck. Valerie, my absolute monster of a wife, was legally listed as a primary official shareholder on the offshore account, because she was the one actively laundering the dirty money every single month. And DeAndre was her legally recognized biological son. Aaliyah was her legally recognized biological granddaughter. We absolutely did not need to act like criminals and hack into Richard's bank account to steal the $20 million. We did not need to wait for a slow-moving federal judge or a sympathetic jury to grant us legal permission to access the stolen funds. Richard had accidentally built a fully legal loaded weapon pointed directly at his own arrogant head, and he had carelessly left it sitting right out in the open on the table. The emergency philanthropic dispersal clause was still entirely active. It was fully legally binding under strict international corporate law. And because it was classified as an emergency medical clause, it completely bypassed all standard banking delays, all corporate board approvals, and all executive oversight. It was specifically designed to trigger an absolute instantaneous wire transfer directly to any registered hospital in the world. My son looked at me, and his dark, exhausted eyes were burning with the fierce, unyielding fire of absolute, complete justice. Richard and Valerie had coldly denied our insurance claim, viewing my sweet Aaliyah's tragic death as a convenient financial reset for their selfish luxury lifestyle. They had completely stolen my entire life savings and stolen my family home just to fund their sick, twisted games. They thought they had locked all the heavy steel doors and left us completely trapped inside a burning building to die. But my brilliant, quiet son had just found the master key. DeAndre did not need to beg Richard Montgomery for the $20 million to save his dying daughter. He was going to legally force Richard's own fraudulent corporate framework to pay for the exact customized gene therapy surgery Richard had just ruthlessly denied. He was going to use Richard's own fake tax shield to instantaneously drain $20 million of his stolen dirty money. It was the absolute most beautiful, profound poetic justice I had ever heard in my entire life. Karma was not just coming for them, it was already inside their house. I sat there in the quiet, dim light of the hospital room, listening to the slow, shallow breathing of my sweet, innocent granddaughter. I looked at my brilliant, quiet son, who had been endlessly mocked and humiliated by his wealthy, arrogant in-laws for years. I watched him prepare to execute the most devastating financial counterattack in the history of corporate warfare. He was not just going to save Aaliyah's precious life tonight. He was going to completely obliterate the very foundation of Richard's empire using the very same laws Richard twisted to hurt innocent people. The silent hunter had the monster firmly locked in his crosshairs, and he was finally entirely ready to pull the trigger. I watched my son DeAndre sitting in the dim light of the hospital room, and I realized I was looking at a man who had completely mastered his craft. People watch too many Hollywood movies and they think that taking down a billionaire requires a team of criminals wearing black masks, hacking into mainframe computers in the middle of the night. They think you have to break the law to defeat an evil man. But my son is a certified forensic accountant and a master investigator. He did not need to write a single line of malicious computer code. He did not need to hack into Richard's private corporate servers or steal any digital passwords. DeAndre knew something that arrogant, wealthy criminals like Richard Montgomery always seem to forget. The American legal system and the federal tax codes are essentially just massive, complex machines. And just like any massive engine, if you know exactly which bolts to loosen and exactly which wires to cross, you can use the machine's own immense power to completely destroy it from the inside out. DeAndre turned his laptop screen slightly toward me so I could see exactly what he was doing. He told me that if we just stole the money, Richard would instantly report the theft to the federal authorities and have the hospital assets frozen before Aaliyah could even make it to the operating room. We had to make the transfer absolutely legally binding so that by the time Richard woke up in his multi-million-dollar mansion, he would be entirely trapped in a financial web of his own arrogant design. DeAndre opened a secure encrypted browser and navigated directly to the official government portal for the Securities and Exchange Commission. He then opened a second secure tab for the Internal Revenue Service Federal Whistleblower Division. He explained to me that as a licensed financial investigator, he had the legal authority to file expedited emergency whistleblower liens against any corporate entity if he had irrefutable concrete proof of massive ongoing financial fraud. And thanks to the careless digital trail my wicked wife Valerie had left behind on her cracked tablet, we had an absolute mountain of undeniable proof. For the next 2 hours, DeAndre meticulously uploaded every single piece of evidence into the federal government servers. He uploaded the internal corporate ledgers, proving Richard was systematically embezzling millions from sick patients' trust funds. He uploaded the encrypted emails where Richard personally ordered the denial of Aaliyah's life-saving insurance claim to protect his illegal cash flow. Then he uploaded the massive spreadsheets proving Valerie was actively laundering that stolen money out of my blue-collar bank accounts and funneling it directly into Richard's secret offshore tax haven in the Cayman Islands. DeAndre was methodically building a flawless, impenetrable legal fortress. By filing these massive federal whistleblower reports, DeAndre was legally flagging Richard's entire corporate empire as an active criminal enterprise. But he did not stop there. This was just the foundation of his unthinkable counterattack. The real absolute genius of my son's plan was how he weaponized Richard's own fake charitable tax shield to save my granddaughter's life. DeAndre pulled up the official corporate charter for the Montgomery Global Relief Fund, the massive offshore trust where Valerie and Richard were hiding all their stolen millions. He pointed to the emergency philanthropic dispersal clause, the exact legal loophole Richard had arrogantly created to make his illegal slush fund look like a legitimate medical charity. DeAndre opened a highly specialized international banking terminal on his computer. He began to draft a series of complex legal declarations. He typed out an official binding legal affidavit formally invoking the emergency medical dispersal clause. Because Valerie was legally listed as a primary official shareholder of the offshore trust to facilitate her money laundering, her direct biological descendants were legally entitled to invoke the emergency medical clause. DeAndre attached Aaliyah's official birth certificate proving she was Valerie's biological granddaughter. Then he attached the massive, heavily documented medical file from the pediatric intensive care unit, proving Aaliyah was in immediate catastrophic medical danger. Finally, he attached the official $20 million surgical invoice from the specialized Western Research Facility. But DeAndre knew that if the dispersal request went to Richard's corporate board, they would immediately block it. So my brilliant son used the federal whistleblower liens he had just filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission to perform an absolutely mind-blowing legal maneuver. Under federal financial laws, if a corporate account is credibly flagged for massive criminal embezzlement and money laundering, the government allows a certified whistleblower to petition for temporary emergency executorship to prevent the criminal suspects from hiding or moving the tainted assets. DeAndre legally attached his federal whistleblower status to the emergency medical dispersal request. By doing this, he completely bypassed Richard's entire corrupt executive board. DeAndre legally named himself the temporary executor of Richard's specific fraud-tainted offshore accounts solely for the purpose of facilitating the emergency medical dispersal. He did not break a single law. He used Richard's exact corporate rules and twisted them together with the absolute crushing weight of federal tax regulations. He built a perfect, inescapable legal guillotine. I sat there holding my breath, my heart pounding so hard against my ribs, I thought it was going to completely shatter my chest. DeAndre looked at me, his dark eyes perfectly calm and completely resolute. He told me that once he initiated the final execution sequence, there was absolutely no turning back. The international banking system would instantly verify the legal clauses, verify his temporary executorship through the federal whistleblower liens, and automatically force the liquidation of the requested funds. Richard and Valerie would not even receive a security alert until the money was already gone because DeAndre was using their own authorized corporate emergency protocols. I looked down at Aaliyah. Her breathing was becoming incredibly shallow. The heavy medical machines were beeping in a desperate, rapid rhythm, warning us that her tiny body was running completely out of time. I thought about the decades I spent breaking my back on cold concrete garage floors, trusting a woman who viewed my granddaughter's life as a convenient financial burden. I thought about the arrogant, wealthy monster who sat at my dining room table drinking my wine while secretly stealing millions from dying people. I placed my heavy, calloused hand on my son's shoulder. I squeezed him tight and I told him to drop the absolute hammer on them. DeAndre turned back to his keyboard. He typed in the exact routing number for the Specialized Research Hospital's secure medical escrow account. Then he moved his cursor to the transfer amount box. He did not just type in the $20 million required for the customized gene therapy surgery. He typed in exactly $20.5 million. He told me the extra $500,000 was to cover the absolute best specialized medical transport plane in the country and a year of top-tier physical recovery therapy. He was making absolutely sure that Richard and Valerie paid for every single aspect of her healing. With one final, incredibly calm keystroke, DeAndre hit the execute command. The bright computer screen instantly shifted to a dark loading terminal. A small circular icon began spinning in the absolute center of the screen, connecting to the massive international banking servers. The silence in the hospital room was so heavy, it felt like the entire universe was holding its breath. We were a quiet accountant and an old retired mechanic going head-to-head against a billionaire corporate titan in the middle of the night. I watched the spinning digital icon and prayed harder than I have ever prayed in my entire 68 years of life. The screen suddenly flashed a bright, solid green. A massive block of text appeared on the screen, confirming the international wire transfer. The Montgomery Global Relief Fund had recognized the legally binding emergency philanthropic dispersal clause. The system had verified Aaliyah's catastrophic medical emergency. The system had recognized DeAndre's legal authority as the temporary emergency executor backed by the federal whistleblower filings. Richard's own arrogant fake tax shield had worked exactly the way it was legally written. The screen displayed the final confirmation. Exactly $20.5 million had been forcefully liquidated from Richard's hidden offshore account. The money had completely bypassed all of his corrupt corporate firewalls and had been instantly wired directly into the Western Research Hospital's secure medical escrow account. It was gone. DeAndre had legally seized $20.5 million of Richard's dirty stolen money and used it to save my granddaughter's life. I stood up from my plastic chair feeling completely lightheaded. I could not believe what my eyes were seeing. But the absolute final proof arrived exactly 2 minutes later. DeAndre's encrypted email inbox chimed loudly in the quiet room. It was a direct emergency communication from the chief of pediatric surgery at the Specialized Western Research Facility. DeAndre clicked the email open and read it aloud. His voice finally cracked heavily with profound, overwhelming emotion. The hospital billing department had just received the massive wire transfer. The entire $20.5 million balance had cleared their escrow protocols and was permanently locked in. The surgery was completely paid in full. The hospital director stated that they were immediately dispatching a private specialized medical transport jet to Atlanta. They were going to arrive in less than 4 hours to pick up Aaliyah and fly her directly to their facility to begin the life-saving customized gene therapy procedure. The sheer crushing weight of the past 3 agonizing days completely vanished from my heavy shoulders. The absolute profound relief that washed over my soul was so powerful, it brought me straight down to my knees on the cold hospital floor. I wrapped my thick, massive arms around my son, and we held each other weeping openly in the dim light of the intensive care unit. But these were not tears of sorrow or total despair. These were the pure, beautiful tears of a father and a son who had just fought the absolute devil and completely won. DeAndre had not just saved his daughter's precious life. He had executed the most flawless, devastating counterattack imaginable. While Richard Montgomery was sound asleep in his custom silk sheets, dreaming about his stolen millions and his absolute power, my quiet, brilliant son had just legally gutted his entire criminal empire. While Valerie was sleeping peacefully, believing she had finally escaped her dirty blue-collar husband and secured her luxury high society future, DeAndre had entirely trapped her in her own sickening financial web. They had carelessly left us for dead at the absolute bottom of a dark pit. They never realized that by leaving us with absolutely nothing to lose, they had given DeAndre the complete freedom to unleash a financial guillotine that would sever them from their stolen wealth forever. The miracle surgery was permanently locked in. Aaliyah was going to live, and the absolute total destruction of Richard and Valerie had only just begun. Exactly 12 hours after my brilliant son legally triggered the complete destruction of Richard's financial empire, I stood on the cold, windy tarmac of the Atlanta private airfield. I watched the massive silver engines of a specialized medical transport jet roar to life. Inside that beautiful plane was my sweet, innocent granddaughter, Aaliyah, surrounded by the absolute best pediatric critical care team in the entire country. Sitting right beside her, holding her tiny hand, was my son, DeAndre. He looked out the small, oval window and gave me a slow, firm nod. He was taking his daughter to the West Coast Research Facility to receive her miracle cure. My boy had done his job flawlessly. He had secured the $20 million and locked in the customized gene therapy surgery. Now it was my turn to do my job. I watched the heavy plane lift off into the bright morning sky, carrying my entire heart to safety. Once the plane disappeared into the clouds, the heavy, crushing sorrow of the past 3 days completely left my body. It was entirely replaced by the cold, hard focus of a man walking into a war zone. I got into my old, rusted pickup truck and drove straight back into the heart of the city. While my granddaughter was flying across the country to fight for her precious life, my wicked wife Valerie and her arrogant brother-in-law Richard were busy hosting a massive, lavish charity gala at one of the most expensive luxury hotels in downtown Atlanta. It was an annual philanthropic event Richard threw every single year just to stroke his own massive ego and rub shoulders with the wealthy political elite of the city. The absolute sickening irony of the entire situation burned hot in my chest. They were standing in a massive ballroom decorated with crystal chandeliers, drinking expensive imported champagne and masquerading as generous humanitarians. Meanwhile, every single flower arrangement, every single drop of expensive alcohol, and every single designer dress in that room was completely funded by the stolen life savings of dying, vulnerable medical patients and the stolen retirement money of a broken-down old mechanic. They were literally dancing on the graves of the innocent people they had ruthlessly destroyed. I parked my old rusted truck right in the front circular driveway of the massive luxury hotel. The young valet attendants in their pristine red uniforms rushed over looking completely horrified by my loud smoking vehicle leaking dark oil onto their beautiful, clean pavement. I handed the kid my keys and walked straight toward the heavy glass revolving doors. I did not rent a cheap tuxedo for this occasion. I absolutely refused to play dress-up and pretend to belong to their toxic, superficial world. I was wearing my very best heavy canvas mechanic coveralls. The thick navy blue fabric was freshly washed and heavily starched, but it still carried the permanent dark stains of 40 years of honest, grueling manual labor. My name, Jerome, was proudly embroidered in bold white letters right above my left chest pocket. I wore my heavy steel-toed leather work boots that echoed loudly against the polished marble floors of the hotel lobby. I wanted them to see exactly who was bringing their massive, corrupt empire completely to its knees. I wanted them to look at the physical embodiment of the working-class man they had so arrogantly underestimated and casually discarded. I walked up the grand, sweeping staircase toward the main ballroom. There were two massive private security guards standing outside the heavy carved wooden doors, wearing expensive dark suits and earpieces. They took one look at my rough, calloused hands, my heavy mechanic coveralls, and my stern face, and they immediately stepped forward to block my path. They told me the charity gala was an exclusive private event, and that the service elevator was located in the back of the building. I did not raise my voice, and I did not raise my fists. I simply looked the closest guard dead in his eyes, with the absolute freezing cold certainty of a man who has absolutely nothing left to fear on this earth. I told him my legal wife was inside hosting the event, and if he put a single hand on my body, I would personally ensure he spent the rest of his natural life eating through a plastic straw. The sheer absolute terror in my voice must have completely paralyzed him, because he slowly stepped aside and let me pull the heavy wooden doors wide open. The moment I stepped inside the massive ballroom, the overwhelming smell of expensive perfume and roasted prime rib hit my face. The room was absolutely packed with hundreds of wealthy socialites, wealthy corporate executives, and arrogant politicians. A classical string quartet was playing soft, elegant music in the corner. I walked straight down the center aisle of the room, my heavy steel-toed boots thudding rhythmically against the expensive hardwood floor. People immediately stopped talking. The wealthy elites turned their heads and stared at me in total absolute shock. They looked at my blue-collar uniform like I was a filthy wild animal that had somehow wandered into their pristine golden cage. The soft classical music slowly faded out as the entire massive room fell into a dead, heavy silence. The crowd parted right down the middle, like the Red Sea clearing a direct, unhindered path straight toward the front stage. And there they were. Standing near the massive ice sculpture at the head table, holding delicate crystal glasses of champagne, were the three absolute monsters who had tried to murder my family. Vivian was wearing a custom silk gown, dripping in stolen diamonds. Richard was wearing a flawless $10,000 custom-tailored Italian tuxedo, looking like the absolute king of the world. And standing right next to him, looking perfectly healthy and entirely unbothered by the fact that she had left her only granddaughter to suffocate to death in a cold hospital room, was my wife, Valerie. When Valerie finally spotted me walking toward her, the smug, arrogant smile completely slid off her face. Her eyes went wide with pure, absolute panic and deep embarrassment. She quickly looked around at all her wealthy high society friends, realizing that her dirty, secret working-class husband had just publicly crashed her perfect luxury fantasy. Richard immediately puffed out his chest and set his crystal glass down hard on the table. His face turned a furious bright red. He started waving his hand frantically toward the security guards at the back of the room, yelling for them to come remove this filthy trespassing mechanic immediately. I did not stop walking until I was standing less than 2 feet away from Richard's arrogant face. The entire massive ballroom was so completely silent you could hear a single pin drop on the thick carpet. Valerie stepped forward, her voice hissing like a venomous snake. She demanded to know what I was doing there and told me I was completely ruining her entire life by showing my face in this room. I looked at the woman I had fiercely loved and protected for 35 years, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, heavy disgust. I did not scream at her. I did not insult her. I reached my rough, calloused hand deep into the front chest pocket of my navy blue mechanic coveralls, and I pulled out a single neatly folded piece of crisp white paper. I slowly unfolded the heavy paper and held it up so the bright chandelier light caught it perfectly. It was the official banking receipt printed directly from the Western Research Hospital's secure medical escrow account. I looked Richard dead in his cold blue eyes, and I shoved the piece of paper directly against his expensive silk chest, forcing him to grab it with his own 2 hands. Richard looked down at the paper with absolute total confusion. He read the heavy black ink stamped across the top of the page. Medical escrow transfer confirmation. Paid in full. Then his arrogant blue eyes slowly tracked down to the final total amount printed at the very bottom of the invoice, $20.5 million. He scoffed loudly, a harsh, arrogant sound that echoed in the quiet room. He looked at me with total, profound mockery, and told me I was completely insane if I thought he was going to pay a single red cent of my pathetic family's medical debt. He told me he had already personally denied the insurance claim and that I was a completely broken, pathetic old man begging for charity from my betters. Valerie laughed a nervous, cruel laugh and told me to take my fake piece of paper and go back to my dirty little garage where I belonged before Richard had me arrested for corporate harassment. I stood perfectly still, letting their absolute blind arrogance wash completely over me. I looked at Richard and I spoke in a voice so incredibly calm and loud that it carried across the entire silent ballroom. I told him I was not there to beg for his charity. I told him I was there to hand-deliver his final receipt, because my brilliant son DeAndre had already legally finalized the transaction. I told Richard exactly what DeAndre had done. I told him we had found Valerie's hidden digital tablet. I told him we had downloaded every single encrypted email proving his massive medical trust fund embezzlement and every single banking ledger proving Valerie's dirty money laundering operation. Richard's face instantly dropped. The pure, arrogant color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a sick, hollow ghost. Valerie physically stumbled backward, her expensive designer heels catching on the carpet as the absolute horrifying reality of my words finally hit her brain. I leaned in close so only they could hear the absolute final terrifying truth. I told Richard that my son did not just expose his massive criminal empire. I told him DeAndre had used the federal whistleblower laws to name himself the temporary legal executor of the Montgomery Global Relief Fund. I watched Richard's eyes widen in absolute pure terror as I said the name of his secret offshore account out loud in front of the entire wealthy crowd. I told him DeAndre had legally triggered the emergency philanthropic dispersal clause. I told him he had used their own fake offshore tax shield to force the immediate liquidation of exactly $20.5 million. Before Richard could even open his mouth to scream, the absolute most beautiful sound in the entire world completely shattered the silence of the massive ballroom. Richard's expensive custom cell phone tucked inside his tuxedo jacket began to buzz frantically. A loud, piercing digital alarm rang out from his chest. At that exact same moment, Valerie's designer purse started ringing with an identical, frantic, high-pitched chime. Then, Vivian's phone went off. Within 5 seconds, every single corporate executive and board member standing near the head table had their cell phones ringing and buzzing in absolute, total synchronized panic. Richard frantically pulled his phone out of his jacket with trembling hands. I watched him stare at the bright, glowing screen. It was an automated emergency alert from his elite international banking division. His massive hidden offshore trust accounts, the very accounts holding the millions of dollars he had ruthlessly stolen from dying patients, were entirely frozen. The available balance flashing on his screen in bright red digital numbers was absolute zero. The accounts were entirely, completely empty. The $20.5 million was permanently gone, locked entirely away in a specialized medical facility to save the very child he had tried to casually murder. Valerie dropped her expensive cell phone directly onto the hard floor. The glass screen completely shattered, sending tiny fragments flying across the polished wood. She looked at her broken phone and she realized that her entire 5-year exit strategy, her secret escape fund, and her multi-million-dollar luxury future were completely gone. She was absolutely, instantly bankrupt. I stood there in my heavy-duty blue-collar uniform, looking down at the broken, arrogant billionaires, and I finally smiled. Finally. The financial guillotine had dropped perfectly, and their entire corrupt world was completely severed at the neck. Richard stood there, completely frozen, staring blindly at his broken digital screen, while the absolute horrifying reality of his total financial ruin washed over his entire body. The massive ballroom was still completely frozen in absolute shock. The wealthy corporate executives and corrupt local politicians, who usually kissed the very ground Richard walked on, were now slowly backing away from him, like he was carrying a deadly infectious plague. Valerie was down on her hands and knees in her expensive custom silk gown, desperately trying to pick up the shattered pieces of her broken cell phone from the polished hardwood floor. She was weeping loudly, but they were absolutely not tears of genuine remorse. They were the bitter, pathetic tears of a deeply greedy woman who had just watched her entire luxurious high society future burned down to absolute ash. I stood there in my heavy-duty blue-collar mechanic coveralls, completely unbothered by their sudden frantic panic. I told them that the absolute worst part of their nightmare had not even started yet, because taking their stolen dirty money was just the financial penalty. Now it was finally time for them to pay the actual physical price for playing twisted games with my innocent granddaughter's life. Before Richard could even open his arrogant mouth to scream at me, the heavy carved wooden doors at the very back of the massive luxury ballroom suddenly burst entirely open. The soft classical music abruptly stopped as the frightened musicians scrambled entirely out of their elegant chairs. A massive, overwhelming wave of federal agents poured directly into the room. There were over 24 heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission wearing heavy dark tactical vests with bright yellow letters printed boldly across their chests. They moved with absolute terrifying military precision, completely locking down every single exit in the luxury hotel in a matter of seconds. The wealthy high society guests gasped loudly in pure absolute terror. Women wearing stolen diamond necklaces shrieked, and men wearing expensive custom-tailored tuxedos pressed themselves flat against the decorated walls, desperately trying to get as far away from Richard as legally possible. The lead federal agent walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, marching directly toward the head table with absolute heavy authority. Richard tried to puff out his chest and desperately put on his arrogant, untouchable billionaire persona one last time. He raised his chin and loudly demanded to know the meaning of this absolute legal outrage. He told the federal agent that he regularly played golf with the state governor and that he would personally ensure every single one of them was entirely fired and stripped of their government pensions by tomorrow morning. The lead agent did not even blink. He completely, entirely ignored Richard's pathetic, empty threats. He reached deep into his dark tactical jacket, pulled out a massive, thick stack of official federal arrest warrants, and slammed them face down onto the table right next to the expensive crystal champagne glasses. The agent looked Richard dead in his cold blue eyes and read the heavy federal charges entirely out loud so every single wealthy elite in that massive room could hear exactly what kind of monster he truly was. Richard Montgomery was officially placed under immediate federal arrest for massive corporate fraud, international money laundering, criminal embezzlement, and felony manslaughter endangerment. The agent explicitly and loudly stated that Richard's calculated denial of Aaliyah's medical claim using embezzled patient trust funds officially constituted a deliberate reckless endangerment of human life. Two massive federal agents stepped forward aggressively, grabbed Richard's arms, and violently slammed him face down onto the expensive white linen tablecloth. The beautiful crystal glasses shattered onto the floor as they forcefully pulled his arms behind his back and locked heavy cold steel handcuffs entirely around his wrists. The untouchable billionaire king was completely reduced to a helpless, sweating criminal groveling in spilled imported champagne. Then the federal agents turned their sharp, cold attention entirely toward my wife. Valerie tried to stand up, but her legs completely gave out from underneath her. She looked at the heavy steel handcuffs dangling from the agent's thick black belt, and pure, absolute, blinding panic completely took over her entire physical body. The deeply arrogant woman who had proudly called my honest blue-collar life a pathetic, dirty prison was now directly facing the horrifying reality of a literal federal penitentiary. The agent read her rights out loud, officially charging her with massive felony embezzlement and domestic money laundering. Valerie started hyperventilating wildly. She turned her terrified, weeping eyes toward me, and she did the absolute most sickening, completely pathetic thing imaginable. She actually tried to beg for my help. She crawled toward me on the expensive hotel carpet, desperately grabbing the heavy canvas fabric of my dirty mechanic coveralls. Her expensive designer makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She wept loudly and pleaded with me to tell the federal agents that it was all just a massive, terrible misunderstanding. She called me her sweet, loving, loyal husband. She begged me to call DeAndre immediately and have him completely undo the federal whistleblower reports. She said we could go back to our beautiful suburban home right now and be a happy, loving family again. I looked down at the woman who had happily and coldly walked out of a pediatric intensive care unit, leaving our sweet Aaliyah to suffocate to death just so she could live in a luxury mansion in Florida. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy, empty disgust. I gently but firmly grabbed her wrists and peeled her perfectly manicured hands completely off my work uniform. I looked her dead in the eyes and spoke in a voice as cold as absolute ice. I told her I did not have a wife anymore. I told her my only real family was currently flying thousands of miles away to fix the precious little girl she actively tried to murder for cash. I stepped back and nodded silently to the federal agents. They hauled Valerie up roughly by her expensive silk shoulders, spun her around, and locked the heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. The sharp metallic click of those heavy cuffs closing forever was the absolute most satisfying, beautiful sound I have ever heard in my entire 68 years of life. They dragged Richard and Valerie right down the center aisle of the massive ballroom. It was an absolute, profound, devastating public execution of their massive, inflated egos. Every single wealthy socialite, every single arrogant corporate executive, and every single elite politician they had spent years trying to desperately impress stood there watching them in total, absolute, utter disgust. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal transport vehicles outside brightly illuminated the heavy glass hotel doors. They were marched directly out of that luxury gala, stripped entirely of their stolen wealth, stripped of their fake high society status, and stripped of every single ounce of their human dignity. They were thrown roughly into the back of the dark federal transport vans, exactly like common discarded street trash. Vivian Richards' arrogant wife was completely, entirely hysterical. She had not been officially named in the active money laundering warrants today, but her entire lavish lifestyle was completely and permanently destroyed. The federal agents coldly informed her that every single one of their bank accounts, luxury properties, and imported vehicles had been fully seized by the United States government pending the massive criminal investigation. She was left standing alone in the hotel lobby, wearing a stolen diamond necklace that legally no longer belonged to her, with absolutely no home to return to. She was completely, entirely financially ruined. The legal aftermath over the next several months was entirely swift and absolutely brutal, because DeAndre had provided the federal government with an immaculate, undeniable digital roadmap of their entire complex criminal enterprise. Richard and Valerie did not stand a single chance in federal court. There were absolutely no long, drawn-out legal battles or expensive secret corporate settlements. The federal prosecutors used the encrypted emails and the hidden banking ledgers to absolutely crush them under the full heavy weight of the justice system. Richard was officially sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Valerie, the woman who was completely terrified of living a simple, honest, working-class life, was permanently sentenced to 20 years in a federal women's prison facility. She officially traded her custom-tailored silk dresses for a heavy, rough orange jumpsuit and a tiny, freezing concrete cell. They will both spend the rest of their miserable natural lives locked inside tiny, dark cages, completely forgotten by the wealthy world they sacrificed their own flesh and blood to join. But the absolute greatest, absolute most profound victory of all did not happen inside a cold federal courtroom. The true beautiful miracle happened exactly 3 weeks later inside a bright, sterile recovery room on the beautiful, sunny West Coast. The specialized medical transport jet had successfully delivered Aaliyah and DeAndre to the advanced research facility with time to spare. The $20.5 million DeAndre had forcefully legally liquidated from Richard's stolen offshore account completely covered every single aspect of the highly customized procedure. The brilliant medical researchers fully mapped her specific genetic code and successfully synthesized the revolutionary cellular gene therapy. I was sitting right there beside her hospital bed when the lead pediatric surgeon finally walked into the quiet room. He did not have the heavy, dark, depressed expression of a man delivering a terrible death sentence. He had a bright, brilliant, massive smile stretching completely across his face. He looked at DeAndre and me, and he delivered the exact beautiful words we had been desperately praying to the universe to hear. The customized gene therapy surgery was an absolute, complete, total success. The microscopic biological cellular mutation had been entirely overwritten and perfectly corrected. Her fragile internal organs were already beginning to rapidly heal and regenerate strong, healthy living tissue. The doctor told us that Aaliyah was not just going to survive this terrible dark ordeal. She was completely, entirely, permanently cured. I watched my beautiful, sweet 8-year-old granddaughter slowly open her bright eyes. The heavy grayish sick color had completely left her skin, replaced entirely by a warm, beautiful, healthy glow. She looked over at me, sitting in the chair wearing my clean blue mechanic coveralls. She reached out her tiny, fragile hand and wrapped her small, soft fingers entirely around my massive, calloused thumb. She smiled a weak but incredibly beautiful, pure smile, and she told me she loved me. I finally completely broke down. The heavy, solid stone wall I had built around my heart for the past month completely shattered into dust. I laid my head down against the soft edge of her warm hospital bed, and I wept. I cried heavy tears of pure, absolute, overwhelming joy. DeAndre wrapped his strong arms completely around my broad shoulders, and we cried together like two men who had just walked completely out of a burning inferno. The monsters were permanently locked away in their dark cages. Their corrupt, massive empire was entirely, completely ash, and our beautiful, precious family was finally entirely safe. It has been exactly 2 long, beautiful years since that dark, terrifying night in the pediatric intensive care unit. Today, the bright afternoon sun is shining warmly over a massive green park right here in Atlanta, Georgia. I am sitting on a freshly painted wooden park bench, feeling the gentle southern breeze against my old weathered face. Right next to me sits my brilliant, quiet son, DeAndre. The heavy, agonizing exhaustion that used to completely weigh down his broad shoulders is entirely gone. He is holding a cold paper cup of sweet tea, relaxing and watching the absolute most beautiful sight in the entire world. Out there on the bright green grass, running as fast as her little legs can possibly carry her, is my sweet, precious granddaughter, Aaliyah. She is completely and perfectly healthy. Her loud, joyful laughter rings out across the open park, clear and bright like a church bell on a Sunday morning. There are no more sterile, cold hospital rooms. There are no more terrifying medical monitors beeping in the dark. There is only vibrant, beautiful, unbothered life. I sit here looking at my surviving family, and I cannot help but reflect heavily on the absolute, undeniable reality of karma. People often think that having massive amounts of stolen money makes you completely untouchable in this world. Richard and Valerie truly believed their massive offshore bank accounts gave them the absolute right to play God with our lives. They thought a dirty old heavy diesel mechanic and a quiet forensic accountant would just roll over and accept absolute total defeat. But they completely forgot the most fundamental, unbreakable law of the universe. You reap exactly what you sow. If you plant dark seeds of pure greed, betrayal, and wicked arrogance, you will eventually harvest your own absolute destruction. No matter how much stolen money corrupt people have sitting in hidden offshore accounts, it will absolutely never be enough to defeat the fierce, unconditional love of a dedicated father and the cold, brilliant mind of a loyal son. Love is the absolute strongest force on this earth. It gave DeAndre the terrifying courage to walk right into the belly of the beast and completely tear down a billionaire empire from the inside out. While my sweet Aaliyah is out here actively chasing yellow butterflies in the warm Georgia sunshine, Richard and Valerie are currently sitting in freezing, tiny concrete cells. They will spend the rest of their natural lives entirely locked away in federal prison, eating terrible, bland food and sleeping on hard, cold metal cots. They permanently lost their massive luxury estates, their stolen diamond necklaces, and their fake high society friends. The universe always completely balances the heavy scales in the very end. The good people, the ones who work incredibly hard, play by the rules, and protect their loved ones, will always ultimately prevail. The wicked will always eventually build the very exact traps that completely destroy them. Now, I want to take a moment to speak directly to every single person listening to my voice right now. If this story showed you the true, unbreakable power of a father's love and made you believe deep down in your soul that karma never misses an address, please hit that like button to bring a little sunshine to this old mechanic's heart. I have spent my entire life working extremely hard, getting my calloused hands dirty and trying to do the absolute right thing for my family. Sharing my deepest agonizing pain and my greatest beautiful victory with all of you is my way of passing on the strength I have gathered over these long 68 years. I want you to subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss a story of absolute complete justice. We live in a very harsh world where greedy, arrogant people constantly try to step all over the innocent. And I want to build a beautiful, strong community right here where we always celebrate the righteous victories of good, hardworking families. I want you to know that you are never completely alone in your daily struggles. Whenever you feel entirely overwhelmed by the toxic, manipulative people in your own life, I want you to remember DeAndre and me. I want you to remember that quiet, endless patience and fierce family love can literally bring down multi-million-dollar corporate empires. You do not need to be loud or arrogant to be incredibly strong. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones holding the absolute most power. And before I go today, I have a very special request for you. Tell me in the comments right now what city you are watching from and what time it is. I really want to know where all my beautiful, strong queens are tuning in from today. Whether you are listening to this early in the morning with your hot coffee or late at night after a long, hard day of providing for your own family, I want to see your exact locations in the comments. I read every single one of those comments, and it fills my old heavy heart with so much profound joy to see this massive, beautiful family we are building together across the country. Never let anyone make you feel small or insignificant just because you work hard for an honest daily living. Keep your head held extremely high, protect your emotional peace, and always entirely trust that the universe will handle your enemies in due time. Stay incredibly blessed, my friends, and thank you so much for spending your precious, valuable time with me today.